The purpose of this screencast video lecture is to introduce our discussion of indefiniteness doctrine. This third and final part will focus on the gap-filling function of contract law. Our textbook describes a hypothetical car lease agreement that I negotiated with my colleague Paul Mahoney. The oral lease contract is rather spare. We identify the car, set the rental rate at $100 a month, and establish a one-year duration for the lease. Our negotiation never mentions the clutch or what to do about any other mechanical problems. But this agreement specifies the essential terms of price and duration and identifies the vehicle. Thus, there should be no indefiniteness problem under the rule of Varney. Even so, this example illustrates how contracts are necessarily incomplete. One of the important functions of contract law is to fill gaps, to supply terms that the parties have left out of their agreement. The terms that courts supply are called default rules. They're like the default settings in Microsoft Word or Firefox or Chrome. You don't have to set them, but you may change them if you want to. So suppose that the car's clutch fails 6 months into the lease. What should a court say if I claim that Mahoney must pay to repair the clutch? Please pause the video now to think about this question. How would we want a court to choose a default rule? Write down your ideas about the best rule for this situation. Did you come up with a good rule? Here are some potential answers. Think first about the way we defined reasonableness. It was a majoritarian standard, what most people would understand in a given situation. By analogy, we could develop a majoritarian default, what most parties would want in these circumstances. What term would most people making car leases agree to for the problem of mechanical failures? So, what is a good majoritarian default for this situation? Well, most people making lease agreements would want a court to choose default rules that maximize the size of the pie that we can divide. That is, the joint value of our deal. Mahoney has a car that he can't use for the year. I need a car and am willing to pay. The purpose of our lease is to realize these gains from trade. That goal requires us to think about both incentives and information. If I'm responsible for the clutch and other mechanical parts, that will give me a strong incentive to take care of the car. No peeling wheels, drag racing, or off-roading. I will take the car in for regular maintenance during the year. But I can't possibly know as much as Paul does about the current condition of the car. If he's responsible for mechanical failures, that will give him a strong incentive to turn the car over to me in good shape, to repair any developing problems. But he can't easily monitor my driving habits. What I do with the car will surely affect the chances of a breakdown. Notice that the goal of this analysis is to uncover who has a comparative advantage in preventing mechanical failures, the car owner or the car lessee. What assignment of responsibility will keep the total cost of repairs and precautions against breakdowns as low as possible? Also notice that it can be a tough question to answer. Perfectly reasonable arguments may point in opposite directions, as in this case. When that's true, a court can at least select one reasonable default rule and let the parties bargain around that rule if they don't like it. An alternative approach is to adopt a tailored default. Ask what Paul and I would have agreed to if we had bargained about the issue. What is a good tailored default for our clutch problem? Well, a court would need more information about the parties. We might start with a majoritarian rule and then adjust that rule based on details of our individual circumstances. A court could look to see how we've addressed similar issues in our lease contract. Or the rule could be based on more detailed information about our ability to prevent mechanical problems, or to gather information about the cause of any particular breakdown. Or a court could try to infer from the structure of our agreement or from details of our negotiations what our own preferences would be about this issue. So which of these approaches is better? Tailored or majoritarian? What problems will courts and the parties encounter under each approach? The simple majoritarian rule is cheapest to administer and clearest in application. It produces relatively predictable outcomes and a lower cost of litigation. But it won't fit well for some parties. One size fits all inevitably won't capture the intent of atypical parties. A tailored default works harder to capture the party's actual intent. But it also makes many more facts relevant. This increased complexity may make outcomes harder to predict. And it may lead to a risk of inconsistent results, uncertainty for the parties, and more costly litigation. To summarize, majoritarian defaults are cheap and certain, but they can be a bad fit for some parties. Tailored defaults, done well, may better capture parties' intent, but they tend to be complex and less predictable. The choice between these approaches depends in part on how much information we have about the parties and their preferences for allocating risks. It also depends on how complicated and context-sensitive we're willing to make the question of choosing a default rule. This comparison also illustrates a classic rules versus standards debate. On the one side, clear but crude, precise rules. On the other side, refined but complex and uncertain, flexible standards. You should be on the lookout in other classes for this issue. It arises in torts, property, criminal law, everywhere. At last, we're ready to consider the problem of indefiniteness. We've often focused on whether or not someone intended to make a contract. Did West intend to board Bascom's Folly with Bailey? Did the Zemmers intend to sell the Ferguson farm to Lucy? Did PepsiCo intend to offer Leonard a Harrier jet? And then in discussing gap filling, we assumed that Paul and I intended to have a contract. The issue is what to do about the terms we hadn't specified, whether to provide and how to provide defaults. The question that remains is how far courts should go in filling gaps. Should there be essential terms that must be specified to form a contract? In the textbook, I suggest two possible readings of these indefiniteness cases. Either the gaps in the agreement are so fundamental that they indicate a lack of intent to contract. The court thinks that the parties didn't intend to make a binding contract. Or the parties intended to contract, but the gaps in drafting are too fundamental to allow the court to fill them. The court cannot aid the parties or must refuse to be imposed upon. Bear these possibilities in mind as we analyze the reasoning in each case. I have two final observations. First, notice that both the intent and drafting arguments begin with a finding of indefiniteness, or significant gaps in the agreement. So that fact doesn't distinguish one issue from the other. A court has to tell us what its concern is, intent or drafting. Notice if the answer is both, then it's an easy case, and any court anywhere will find no contract. Second, understand that we're talking about a special kind of intent. We may often provide informal assurances. For example, I'm happy with your work or product or service, and I'll see to it that you get a fair deal or promoted or contract renewed. But these don't necessarily translate into an intent to make a binding contractual commitment. Remember our Restatement Section 2 requirement of commitment. With this introduction, we're ready to analyze Varney, Corthell, D.R. Curtis, and Schumacher. Thank you for listening.